And welcome to another extremely topical and extremely timely Met webinar. Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently returned from the Middle East, where he traveled to Turkey, Greece, Jordan, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. On Friday, his spokesperson, Matt Miller, told Andrea Mitchell of MSNBC that the Arab nations are ready to discuss, quote, a long-term and short-term solution to Gaza, including the establishment of a Palestinian state. Yet recent polls coming out of Khalil Shikaki's Palestinian Center for Survey and Research indicate that approximately 83% of Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank support Hamas and the October 7th atrocities. Of course, we all know that last Friday, in the case that's being argued before the International Court of Justice in The Hague, Tembeka Nagatobi, an attorney representing South Africa, said that Israel had, quote, genocidal intent in Gaza and that it must immediately cease and desist its military operations there, leaving Hamas in control of Gaza. On November 15th, EU High Representative Josep Borrell issued a statement saying, quote, no to the amputation of Gaza and no to the disassociation of Gaza from the overall Palestinian issue. Our objective must be the resolution to the Palestinian issue as a whole. So there are a great deal of people so far away from the heart of the conflict offering their conclusions of what they see as a potential resolution for Gaza. There are many more voices so detached from the conflict, weighing in and virtue signaling, but they don't have to live with a radicalized Palestinian population so close to their borders, and they do not represent a mortal threat to their very existence. These morally indignant and self-righteous people all offer normative statements of what Gaza should be. Only Richard Goldberg, senior advisor at FDD and former advisor to Senator Mark Kirk, former member of the National Security Council and U.S. Naval Reserves, has written about what should not be the solution. His brilliant analysis appeared in January's Commentary magazine for cover story. Richard has written, quote, if Washington and Jerusalem share an end state objective of a Gaza that can never again pose a terror threat to Israel, and the president himself has said repeatedly that we do share this objective, the question about the future needs to be reframed. Instead of asking what comes next, leaders in both capitals should be asking what cannot come next. Answering that question is the only way to establish the parameters for a viable path forward that precludes the known ingredients for policy failure. Richard, we are really delighted to have you back again. Richard, can you please outline your 5 perimeters for a more stable Israel and Middle East vis-a-vis Gaza? Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for everything you guys do, Emmett, and thanks everybody for taking your lunch hour with us here. When I embarked on this essay, it was in the midst of a lot of people starting to put together task forces, and everybody's going to come up with their big plan of what's going to come next. And you saw the administration rolling out their focus on the Palestinian Authority, of course, has to take over Gaza. And all these different proposals are coming out of the Egyptians and the Qataris and the UN. And how do you sort all these out? And I think about it as though, I have a couple of kids. For anybody who's had a child, and you give them a blank piece of paper and a marker and say, "Draw me something," it doesn't turn out exactly the way you would think at least traditional art should look, maybe an abstract art. But if you give them something with parameters, with some borders, color by number, you say it has to be within these shapes, these sizes, these colors, it comes out pretty well. And I think in this sort of situation where it's almost a blank slate that you might be dealing with, dreaming up fantasies of what you think without having some clear parameters is a recipe for disaster. And so rather than having this conversation about what comes next, let's start with what we know should not come next. Number one, and I thought about whether to include this or not, but I'm glad I did because it's not obvious to a lot of people. It's obvious to us and probably most of the people, hopefully all the people who are joining us today. It's not obvious to the rest of the world. Gaza has no future with Hamas or other terrorist groups involved. End statement. When you look at some of the proposals coming out today, the Egyptian proposal that people have been seeing in the news, that proposal says there should be unification of Hamas and Fatah so that there can be one voice of a Palestinian Authority and endorsement of a technocratic government in Gaza until there's an election at some point, and a reformed, back into the fold Hamas is allowed to participate in that. So it's just going back in time to where we were back in 2006 when Israel had already left the Gaza Strip, and we saw the unity government come together of Fatah and Hamas controlling the Palestinian Authority after that election. We're going to go through the exact same Hamas control of Gaza again. You talk about the insistence on Israel to have a ceasefire, allowing Hamas to retain control or some terror infrastructure in Gaza. And it's still all over the place, no matter where you look. And so, yes, it's connected to the war effort and ensuring that Israel continues that war effort, has Western support to continue its operations in Gaza. But it's also connected to the day after, because there is a large segment of people out there who believe in Hamas having a role in the day after. They don't say it exactly like that, but if you look at their plans, you look at their proposals, that's what's on the table. So, number one, no Hamas, no other terrorist organizations, Islamic Jihad, other organizations. Oh, and by the way, let's not make the same mistakes we made back in 2006, 2007, after Israel withdrew from Gaza and there were elections, and the U.S. pushed the Palestinians into election, pushed the Israelis to accept an election. They might not call themselves Hamas in the future, right? This is a Muslim Brotherhood outfit that are sponsored by the Qataris and the Turks ideologically and financially, in addition to the terrorist support from Iran. What are they going to be called next? The Party of God. The Party of God will suddenly pop up and they want to be part of the political process. Well, we need to have some litmus tests, right? What does it mean to be eligible to participate in the political process, to be eligible to participate in governance? Go back to what their charter is, what their thesis is, what their MO is. Are they willing to state publicly that they recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state? Because if you're not willing to do that, you're not willing to say, let alone, by the way, be pledging destruction of the state of Israel in your rhetoric. You're not willing to do those things. We know who you are. We see through it. Shouldn't be allowed back on the merry-go-round to try to use a political process to get back. And by the way, and this is going to happen, I've already seen some of it coming, there's going to be people talking about an election in the Palestinian Authority. Before we go down that road again, let's talk about what else makes a democracy besides elections. Because what we learned back in 2006 is that elections alone are not a democracy makes if you don't have the underpinnings of rule of law, of respect for individuals, for rights, all these different things that we take for granted. All elections is one more path to power for those that don't believe in democracy and have theocracy and other repressive ideas at their core. Okay, that's number one. Number two, and it's again related to that 2005 unilateral withdrawal, the disengagement plan that Ariel Sharon rolled out in 2005 when Israel left the Gaza Strip and inevitably handed Gaza over to Hamas. That can't happen again. That is probably the single most pivotal decision that looms large over all that is happening today as far as Gaza. And while we don't want to sugarcoat and have revisionist history that everything was great in Gaza until 2005, Hamas could not gain operational control of the Gaza Strip and then use it as a launching pad for rockets and terror until the disengagement. And I think you're seeing this in Israel. I don't know if it's a disconnect in Washington. I fear it still is when you see the rhetoric of Israel has to withdraw or plans like the Egyptians put forward, a full Israeli military withdrawal as part of a hostage deal, and then that unity peace with the Palestinians. If the Israelis make the same mistake of withdrawing all military forces, all military capabilities, all security presence in key areas of the Gaza Strip, so as to prevent the resurgence of terrorist control, they will get exactly that. And so you're already seeing the IDF making moves to take control of the Egyptian border on the south, what they call the Philadelphia route or the Philadelphia corridor. You're going to see them maintain control of some of the key areas along their border, along the Mediterranean border, some of the key arteries, perhaps from north to south. This is going to be essential to be able to respond quickly to cells that will inevitably keep popping up. This is how the IDF conducts itself in the West Bank. They keep security control of the Jordan Valley. They've always talked about the long-term vision being IDF security control of the Jordan Valley to ensure there is nothing untoward coming in across the border. They can have some control over that. They have enough of a security apparatus to respond to Hamas cells, to Islamic Jihad cells, to other Iranian-backed cells, and we see them doing it on an ongoing basis. That is not the same as civilian control. It is not the same as full occupation. And so we're going to need to find this balance of having enough security control to prevent terrorist takeovers, to allow for special operations, rapid response to terror cells as they emerge, as they're identified, and not actually getting in the way of civilian governance, allowing economic ideas to come forward, political ideas to come forward, turning back Gaza to some technocratic Palestinian rule, but not leaving Israel to worry about the resurgence of another terror platform in Gaza. Third, no country that ever sponsored or provided safe harbor to Hamas should be allowed any role in Gaza's future. Again, this seems obvious. It is not obvious. Today, one country that the Biden administration is talking to almost more than any other is Qatar. Now, Qatar has been a sponsor and loyal ally of Hamas because they believe it. They're Muslim Brotherhood allies. They're ideologically aligned with Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. This is not just since 2012 when the Politburo of Hamas moved to Doha. This goes back decades. They were supporting Hamas when they took over the Gaza Strip, and the US, Israel, and Europe tried to put an embargo on Hamas. Qatar was at the leading edge of trying to break that embargo. They were sending them money, trying to help them maintain control of Gaza in the early parts of their takeover after 2007. They are all in. They have been a major part of the problem in Gaza. Obviously, we're not allowing the Iranians in. Nobody thinks that's not controversial to anyone. But amazingly, we are allowing the Qataris in right now. They're talking about putting money into the day after fund. They want to be on the ground because if you allow the Qataris and their Muslim Brotherhood ideology to pump money into the political system, into the economy, into other groups, you can be assured some replica of Hamas will come forward because they will back it. They will be supportive of it. The radicalization of the population will continue. It shouldn't be allowed. The Turks as well should not be allowed any part. The Turks have been providing a massive amount of ideological support, media support. They send various money and goods to the most radical elements of society there. These two countries in particular, any other that's been involved, some of the North African countries, etc., it doesn't really seem like they're going to be major players here. The Turks could have some role. They shouldn't be allowed. The big kahuna to ensure they have no role in the future of Gaza is Qatar. If the Saudis and the Emiratis want to step up, if they want to lead this moderating effort, noting that they are not exactly a friend of the Qataris, as we've seen in certain years. They're antithetical to the ideology that the Qataris push out into the Arab world. Remember, the Qataris are also the sponsor of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera being part of this apparatus So having a Saudi Emirati-led reconstruction effort and backing of a technocratic government makes sense in the concept of the ever-expanding Abraham Accords vision and potential Saudi-Israeli normalization. Having the Qataris be involved doesn't make sense. Fourth, no political party or governing authority that pledges to destroy Israel, promotes terrorism against Israel, or pushes economic warfare against Israel can be part of a post-Hamas Gaza. Pledges to destroy Israel. Well, yeah, well, that makes sense. Promotes terrorism against Israel. Well, obviously. Pushes economic warfare against Israel. Yeah, that's terrible too. We shouldn't allow that. Everybody's saying, yeah, that's the most common sense part of your whole essay. Yeah. You know who qualifies for all three of those things? The Palestinian Authority. It's nuts. The idea that the Palestinian Authority, in its current form, with its current media and schools and textbooks and pay for slay programs and its stated policy, its leader who has an actual PhD in Holocaust denial, which is a thing apparently. I mean, the idea that this would be the institution where you hand control of Gaza, while, by the way, the Palestinian security services have done nothing to actually control and secure the West Bank. We see that on a daily basis with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, other cells still growing and operating throughout the West Bank. Palestinian security services, by the way, have been involved in some of the attacks and battles against the IDF in the last 2 years. Something like 42, at least, Palestinian security service members have been killed in these battles, citing Joe Trusman at FDD in his analysis. And what are we talking about here? You're going to hand over the Gaza Strip? You're going to believe that Gaza will be de-radicalized and secured by the Palestinian Authority when all they've done is leave the West Bank, the Judea and Samaria areas that they control, less secure, more radicalized than when they became the Palestinian Authority? It's mind-boggling. If there's a number of reforms that are verified that the Palestinian Authority wants to commit itself to, and there would have to be many, we can have a conversation. But the PA as it is today, I'm not going to say, a lot of people have said it's no better than Hamas. I think that's a stretch. It's certainly not good. Let's put it that way. Fifth and last, and this is the one that I think is toughest in the policy making circles and where you run into a lot of challenges, and I worry that this one is not on the table even in Israel. International organizations that promote anti-Semitism or incitement against Israel. Those organizations that are complicit in Hamas's war crimes that we see unfolding every day. Organizations that fail to submit their staff or contractors for basic US counterterrorism vetting cannot be trusted to help build a better future for Gaza. Who is the poster child for an international organization that meets all of these criteria? UNRWA. UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, the so-called Palestinian Refugee Agency. First of all, we have now learned that taking an entire population of Gaza, right, 2.1 million, 1.7 of them being considered refugees under UNRWA's control, trying to make an entire population believe ideologically that they are refugees waiting to return to the land of Israel, waiting to kick all the Jews into the sea, with textbooks that are toxic, learning how to hate Jews and prepare to kill Jews, with media that's provided to them that just feeds on all of this. All of that together, even if it was just that, has created the environment for what we see in front of us today. But it's not just that. Unlike any other UN agency, UNRWA is completely local staff, 30,000 people who live in the areas of the Palestinians, whether it's West Bank or Gaza. Gaza, about 37% of their budget, has an enormous number of UNRWA staff. Those people, in some cases, are Hamas or Hamas allies, or Islamic Jihad and their allies. We've seen that now up close and horrific. UNRWA employees reportedly taking in some of these hostages. Hamas says, "Here, take these hostages into your house." It's an UNRWA employee, as we saw one report. We've seen a number of other workers that have been complicit in some of these war crimes. The schools, the hospitals, all these different sites being given over to Hamas to build tunnels underneath, to use as staging areas for rocket attacks. They know what they're doing. They know what's going on. They turn a blind eye. Fundamentally, we have a big problem because the UN does not recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. They don't recognize Islamic Jihad. They don't recognize Hezbollah. These are not UN listed terror organizations. That means that whether it's UNRWA, the World Health Organization, the International Red Cross, you name it, they don't see terrorist label, they see political organization. They have a non-discriminatory policy, they'll tell you, to ensure there's no political discrimination. Which means if you're Hamas, no problem. You still get the money, you still get the aid, you can be employed, etc. And we don't do anything about it. We hand over handfists of cash. $1 billion to UNRWA since President Biden restored funding to UNRWA in 2021. So think about 37% of that getting funneled into Gaza. That was a number as of last year. We've already been sending more since the war started. That is insane. We are truly subsidizing Hamas there. And you can't trust UNRWA. Now, there had been a long time where part of the debate had been, should we transfer UNRWA's mission to the other UN refugee organization that actually is responsible for all refugees in the world? And that's the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. They're all international staff, far fewer than UNRWA. Their mission is to get people out of refugee status as quickly as possible. And they also, by the way, are responsible for giving aid to internally displaced people who are not refugees. Well, there's no argument that 1 million people have gone south and are displaced and keep moving around Gaza during this conflict. These are IDPs under international law. These are internally displaced people. Well, UN High Commissioner for Refugees is well postured to give aid and to help those people when they move back, get repositioned, get back on their feet. This would be a moment for us to actually test the idea of getting rid of UNRWA. If you could get rid of it in the West Bank and elsewhere, you'd do the world a favor. If you could transition it, at least in Gaza, and say, hey, you're out, you're done, no more UNRWA here. We're turning over all of your apparatus to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they have a mandate to get people into their post-displaced, post-refugee status as quickly as possible and end their mission as quickly as possible. This is not going to be a permanent status for people. You can do a lot of good. If, however, UNRWA, which is the easy answer, not just for us, but for the Israelis, because it's ready-made. If you're trying to quickly get humanitarian assistance into Gaza, if you want to try to get trucks going into Gaza, who's got the infrastructure? UNRWA. So why ruffle feathers? Why create one more argument? Why create more challenges? Yes, UNRWA does a lot of bad, but at least we have a mechanism for aid delivery quickly, and the international community won't ever get rid of UNRWA, and the US won't ever get rid of UNRWA. So we got to do something. So here is UNRWA. Let's keep supporting it. Well, then we're going to be back where we started, I fear, because UNRWA will be a vehicle to subsidize all those extremist groups, all the terror groups that try to come back up to the surface and take control of Gaza in the future. If we don't reconcile this challenge, and I think that's a big hurdle for us in the future, and it's got to be addressed now. If you can't address UNRWA now after what we've seen in Gaza, my goodness, we'll never address it. And that's it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, let's go to UNRWA first. In this session, Brad Sherman's Peace and Tolerance Act was passed, which basically once again has said that we must study the UNRWA textbooks, which is a feel-good but meaningless piece of legislation. We do have another piece of legislation, which unfortunately is all Republican, Chip Roy's UNRWA Transparency and Accountability Act. Also, Minority Chair James Rich is the sponsor of that. But in both the Senate and the House, it's all Republican. How do we break this deadlock? I mean, we've been talking about UNRWA forever, ever since you first worked for then Congressman, the congressman where we were working together, and then senators together. I mean, it's been forever that we've been talking about UNRWA, and for some reason, it seems to be like a knee-jerk response that we're constantly just funneling money into the UN and funneling money into UNRWA. How do we break this logjam there?
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember that UNRWA operates under a UN General Assembly mandate.
Right.
And so to actually get rid of UNRWA, or to truly change its mandate and what it does, how it's structured, how long it can exist for, have a timetable for transition, things like that, you would take a General Assembly resolution, or at the very least, you would need, I believe, more than a third of GA members to vote no on its budget, and you could block its renewal and force a reform debate. Now, that would take a lot of work at the General Assembly, and nobody's wanted to put that kind of muscle into reform. I always believed it was the next step for the Trump administration after they had defunded UNRWA to sort of put the position down, lay the gauntlet, say, here's our conditions, here's what needs to be changed. We're not going to fund this anymore out of the US. And that was a large chunk of their budget that was taken out. So first step is we should stop funding. And Congress, the House Republican appropriations bill that had been put forward, I don't believe it's going to make it through the reconciliation with the Senate. And obviously, if they're going to go to CR, it's all moot. But they had actually put in some very strict conditionality on aid to UNRWA to try to drive those reforms. The other alternative is simply to delete the funding and not allow it. Senate Democrats don't support that. Biden administration doesn't support that, obviously. If there is a new president next year, one of the policies could be very, very quickly to return to the 2018 decision, and that is to defund UNRWA. That will be unpopular in diplomatic cocktail circles, but it is one major way of us using our leverage to drive some kind of reform. And what we had actually seen was, hey, UNRWA magically didn't collapse after we defunded them. Even though they come back and they do all these emergency appeals every couple of months. Oh, the sky is falling. We're running out of money. We need $100 million immediately. Shockingly, taking a quarter of their budget out from the United States, the doors were open and everything kept rolling. So it kind of makes you wonder, where does all the money go? Number two, we saw a lot of donor fatigue from the Arab world and from the Europeans, who are also sort of growing concerned of what is this organization. Every single year, UNRWA grows in service population, because when you have a never-ending idea of refugeehood, that every generation inherits refugee status, and people have a number of kids, and the population grows, then you need to go back to the UN, you need to go back to the United States and say, now you're on the hook to fund this many people instead of this many people. So fiscally, it's unsustainable. This is like a Medicare program for Gaza and the West Bank, of the international community. That's not acceptable as a donor. And then there's the actual terror examples, the incitement of the textbooks, etc. You've seen this in Canada in the past, Australia sometimes in the past, and European governments in the past. There's real concern for what UNRWA does and doesn't do. So yes, I agree with you. A lot of these pieces of legislation that come forward every year do nothing. When you see members of Congress send an angry letter to the Secretary General about UNRWA, no, it is completely meaningless. It gets press because that was the intent, I guess. But if you've all now seen the UN Secretary General since October 7th, understand that letter gets put in a circular filing cabinet very quickly. We have our money, and we have our ability to influence other countries with our money to get votes done in the UN. And so you would need is A, us doing maximum leverage of our funding to cut off UNRWA, and then B, pushing as hard as possible on partners throughout the international community who share our concern to try to block its funding renewal at the UN and then force reforms or transition to the UN High Commissioner of Refugees or some other arrangement.
Okay, let's get back to the duplicity of Doha. Israel is in somewhat of a difficult position because, as you know, there are two objectives of the war. One is to rid Gaza of Hamas control. The other one is to rescue the hostages. And it seems that Doha is the only country that has a relationship with Hamas that can stand as the go-between and negotiate, hostage release. How do we square this round peg?
Yeah, I've written a lot on this, and I'm very saddened by how easily both the Israelis and many in the American Jewish community have fallen prey to Doha's complete scam. You cannot be the arsonist and then come to the rescue and claim to be the firefighter. I liken Qatar to that character in those whodunits or those crime drama television shows where the detectives are trying to figure out this case of multiple attacks or multiple things going on. And every scene, there's this awkward person who shows up and says, I can help you. I saw something. And it turns out the witness and the person helping the cops is actually the person setting all the fires or committing all the crimes. And that's why I had such knowledge. You cannot play the role of neutral arbiter in a hostage negotiation if you are actually not just friends, not just allies, but sponsors of Hamas. They have a conflict of interest. Their primary interest is Hamas's survival. Their secondary interest is their image in the West. Anything they negotiate tries to balance those two together. And we've seen that. Now, that is not to ignore the raw emotion in Israel. It is not to ignore the pleas of the hostage families. And it's not to say that at sometimes we do irrational things when our enemies are not rational. But understand, the Qataris get zero credit for anything. And in fact, the absence of maximum pressure on Doha right now is the missing ingredient to forcing more concessions, getting hostages out quicker. I'll give you an example. There was an entire ceasefire brokered, right, for a week, and hostages were released. Can you imagine that Qatar, being a quote unquote non-NATO ally, this premier country in the Middle East that hosts a major US air base, that gets showered with praise by the president, the secretary of state, the national security advisor, featured right now for those watching the happenings in Davos, Switzerland, that country can somehow not get every American citizen out during that ceasefire, could not put pressure on Hamas to get that done, or more likely didn't want to, knew that they wanted to have more insurance cards, that American citizens were pricey, that they wanted to make sure there was American skin in the game and desperation in the future. The idea that we have not threatened sanctions on the Qataris, while they today still host all Hamas leaders. They're still there, living great, going on television, doing Al Jazeera interviews, spreading incitement, plotting with the Iranians, who they allow to come into Qatar to meet with Hamas leaders, to then travel around and spread sort of next moves. I mean, they're literally plotting out the next moves for this axis of terror. And we're fine with it. We don't talk about moving the base. In fact, reportedly, we've given them a 10-year extension, no strings attached. We don't have other options for an air base. It has to be in Qatar. Of course, we have other options. The Saudis would pay for it. We don't talk about amending the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act the way that we've done in the past for Iran, the way that we have done in 2016 for Saudi Arabia because of 9/11 to allow victims of 10/7 to sue Qatar. That should be on the table. All these things should be on the table to crack down on the double game, to force the Qatari to finally choose. You're either a Western ally or you're a terror ally. You can't just be the Swiss bankers to the Nazis of the 21st century. It doesn't work that way. And by the way, it applies to the Taliban, it applies to other radical groups as well. This is just the latest example that has bitten us in the rear. And so I don't know what it's going to take to wake people up here. There was a codel that just went over of House members. There was a Senate codel before that. Some of the reports look like people are starting to get tough, starting to tell the Qataris, you're not doing enough. You haven't done enough. When this is over, there's going to be a reckoning. You have to close all the Hamas offices, turn over all the Hamas leaders for extradition, all these things. Al Jazeera needs to get shut down. Why is it allowed? I saw a comment from somebody in Q&A. Totally right. Why is it allowed in Israel? Why is it allowed in America? How do we not have sanctions on this entity? It's not even required to be registered under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, even though it's Qatari sponsored. That's crazy. And now we see proof of material support to Hamas throughout the war from Al Jazeera. We should have a prosecution of Al Jazeera come forward under material support. I don't know why we haven't moved on them. That should be a day one move by a future administration, because clearly this administration is very focused on working with the Qataris. I'll say one other thing. The Jewish community in the United States has been suckered by the Qataris. The Qataris are funding foundations that are advising Jewish organizations and hostage families on how to proceed with public rhetoric and lobbying and activism, especially with how to speak about Qatar. Understand that. The Richardson Center, there's another foundation. They all came together. They brought themselves to the hostage families. They brought themselves to major Jewish organizations and said, we know how to do this. We know we have good relations in Doha. We know how to get hostages out. Listen to us. We will run quarterback for your whole strategy. Never disclose that they were Qatari funded the entire time. To this day, won't say how much money they get from the Qataris, though it appears to be very significant. And people move on. All right, well, what else are we supposed to do? You know what you can do? You can say, get out of my office. Get out of here. I'm not listening to you anymore. We're putting maximum pressure on Qatar. We're going to start holding rallies outside the Qatari embassy. We're going to call for Congress to put sanctions on Qatar. All these things that could be done are not being done. So everybody who may be involved in a Jewish organization, ask the leadership if they are involved with the Richardson Center in any way, if they're allowing the Richardson Center to call the shots, if they're muted in their opposition to Qatar because they've been advised so by Qatari funded assets. Find out. It's happening. And it will be a real black spot in history when the history of the hostage crisis is written.
And we all know that Qatar is the largest foreign donor to our nation's universities, which is part of the problem which we have in the nation's universities right now. As you also know, another part of our Israel's objective in the war, obviously, is to free Gaza of Hamas. Yet, largely due to American and international pressure, they have just entered a new phase of the war where it's much more targeted, also putting many IDF soldiers at risk. I know when you wrote this, you were very, very optimistic about the outcome of the war. Do you still believe that Israel will be able to attain its goals of having Gaza free of Hamas in such a way?
Yeah, the caveat I put in there was if the IDF is allowed to do what it needs to do, it will be able to clear the operational control of Hamas in Gaza. There are some worries right now that this hastened transition to low intensity operations in northern Gaza was premature. And you may see the IDF have to turn back and go to a higher intensity operations if in fact they, thought that they had gotten the job done enough to satisfy and pacify Washington pressure, but hadn't actually cleared out northern Gaza. And that's obviously going to be a lesson learned for the South as well. So it's too soon to know, but I'm watching northern Gaza as much as I'm watching southern Gaza, because I don't think we should assume that northern Gaza is Hamas free. It's not. They may have significantly degraded command and control in northern Gaza, but the extent to which that can be turned back on, that with less pressure they can organize again. If you start seeing ambushes, if you start seeing various things uptick in northern Gaza, you may see an increased activity level of the IDF. So, this is going to be a controversy, I think, in Israel. It's probably already being debated inside the security cabinet. But the IDF should not be making operational decisions based on pressure from Washington to wrap up, to call it a day. That is going to lead to increased IDF losses and risk the actual objective of a Hamas-free Gaza.
Right. It's very difficult for Israel when they are so dependent on Washington for armaments. So they're, in somewhat of a catch-22. And now I am going to turn the podium over to my wonderful executive assistant, Karen Benjamin, who will read some of the questions that have come in. Karen?
Hi, so there have been a lot of questions about the US's role in this conflict, such as why does the current administration protect Iran and Qatar? What can the American Jewish community do? And I'm going to throw in a question of my own here. How does this upcoming election this fall affect the conflict?
The last one I'll take first. I think it's clear that while the majority of Americans still support Israel, and I think will for the duration, and don't want to see the U.S. cut off support or do anything like that, the entirety of the conflict, like what the Houthis are doing in the Red Sea, like going back to Afghanistan withdrawal disaster, like the war with Russia and Ukraine, all gives the electorate a feeling of angst, of the world's on fire and this is happening under this president. And so I do suspect that the White House, they're sort of, Tony Blinken went on this containment tour a couple weeks ago throughout the Middle East. Their whole messaging is containment, contain escalation, prevent escalation, tamper it down, keep it on Gaza, move Gaza to low intensity operations, appease everyone in the Middle East, no conflict, no other things, don't let it spread. I think that's because they want to get on with the election season and they want the environment to improve. That, sort of there was a war, we moved on, he did right by the Israelis, he also did right by the Palestinians in calling for humanitarian aid, and let's focus on the economy, or something like that. So I think that has a great deal to do with the pressure being put from Washington to quote unquote wrap it up. And it has major implications on Israeli decision making for Lebanon and Hezbollah, which is the expectation that that's the next theater here. When Gaza is in a position where the IDF feels comfortable looking north, they've issued some pretty clear demands and threats, and those may lead to a much more significant military action in southern Lebanon. If the United States is pushing for de-escalation in Gaza at this point, after 10/7, I don't see how they're getting behind a major escalation in southern Lebanon. So this is going to be the largest point of disconnect between Washington and Jerusalem very quickly. It already is behind the scenes. As far as the American policy, listen, since October 7th and all the days since, it has been very clear that the president has been focused on maintaining as much as possible October 6th policies and strategy, while trying to focus on simply narrowing the question of what should change. And the only change is we support Israel in attacking Hamas. So he has a big grand strategy of Iran, and that has to do with nothing else matters but the nuclear program. And the only way to stop the nuclear program is to give them money. And so we're going to do whatever we can to maintain this diplomatic engagement, have various sources of cash made available, try to keep them under the 90% weapons grade uranium threshold, while giving them $10 billion out of Iraq, the $6 billion out of South Korea, which he had to refreeze, though who knows if it's still frozen. That's just a policy. And all the oil shipments going from Iran to China. It was a deal cut over the summer. There's been plenty of reporting about it. It's a nuclear deal. He didn't submit it to Congress. That was already illegal, whatever. The issue at hand, though, is nothing has actually changed in that Iran policy since October 7th. Started by distancing Iran from the Hamas massacre. Iran didn't know about it. Iran wasn't behind it. We have no evidence. We have no smoking gun. Yeah, we hold Iran accountable ultimately because they're Hamas's sponsor, but we don't think Iran didn't know it was going to happen. Don't have to change our Iran policy. That's why they did that very quickly. And then just a couple weeks, 10 days, I think, after October 7th, the UN missile embargo expired. And they let it happen because it was part of the deal with the Iranians to let that happen, not trigger what's called the snapback of the United Nations to restore all the sanctions on Iran. They started firing, every single day at our troops in Iraq and Syria. The Houthis letting loose in the Red Sea. None of it changing the Iran policy whatsoever. In fact, they're doing everything possible not to change their Houthi policy while the Houthis are attacking commercial vessels in the Red Sea. This is amazing. We have conducted limited airstrikes and missile strikes against the Houthis. We've been doing missile defense combat in the Red Sea for a couple months, and yet we refuse to put the Houthis back on the foreign terrorist organization list. We refuse to target command and control, senior leadership, any of the Iranian assets that are helping the Houthis guide their targeting on the ground in Yemen and on the coast in a ship. And even just in the last 24 hours, you saw a big hullabaloo that they made the decision to relist the Houthis as a terror group. No, they didn't. They didn't. They got a big press release out of it, a lot of press. But we learned that they did not put them back on the foreign terrorist organization list. They put them back on a sanctions list. And then this morning, predictably, put out a press release letting everybody know that they granted a historic number of carve-outs and exceptions to the sanctions. The National Security Advisor just issued a statement before we got on the webinar, and he says, "We are proud to let you know we have issued a historic number of carve-outs to this move." Well, I mean, can you imagine saying that with a straight face? They're proud of it? So they've done nothing. Why? Because the Houthis are supposed to be a legitimized political actor as part of a peace process that they endorse in Yemen, in which the Houthis take control of a lot of territory and get a lot of money, and the Iranians are happy for it. So nothing has changed. The Qataris, Doha has an enormous amount of influence in Washington. It's bipartisan. It's a major problem. So many people are on the payroll. People that you respect, people that you see on television, they have some conflict of interest. A lot of them. I won't name names. It's a problem. Their money into universities, their money into nonprofits, their money into all these different things you didn't know. Did anybody even know the Richardson Center that advises on hostages, was funded by the Qataris? No, I didn't know. The Jewish Insider had a big expose on it. All of these things work together. They're lobbyists, they're PR firms, all that. And it creates this just echo chamber that protects them. They've built this. They've spent so much money on it, on their brand management. And so it's very difficult to penetrate that. It's a real belief among many in Washington that we need the Qataris. Strong ally, very important. And nobody has an answer to say, well, How are we allowing them to still host Hamas? How are we allowing them to sponsor Hamas? How have we ever allowed this to happen? How are we allowed to turn a blind eye to Al Jazeera? Um, and so that's it. There's going to have to be a lot of courage of people who are willing to take the arrows, because Qataris play dirty. Their detractors, their enemies, they play dirty. So I've changed all my passwords and made sure, because I'm sure the Qataris will come after me. But it's a problem in Washington.
Our next set of questions has to do with the sentiment of the Palestinians. Generally, if we were to somehow get some Palestinian representative to agree to all of these conditions, which would be, a miracle in and of itself, what would be the enforcement body? How would you have the quote unquote denazification of the population, not just textbooks, but street names, an entire culture shift?
That is a very good question. Within the parameters that you would establish, you would need that to be one of the conditionalities of support for the technocratic government that comes out. I think we should not think in terms of like de-Baathification. Both the connotation and the actual practice and policy turned out to be a mistake. And so to the extent that you're going to need police, you're going to need civil servants, you're going to need people who actually keep the lights on and do, simple things, jail keepers, all the people that actually like help a government run. Some of these people may at some point have had an affiliation to survive because they believe it. I don't know why. I mean, Hamas controls Gaza. It's a major force there. And we're not going to make believe that, these people like Israel all of a sudden. You're not going to make them like Israel or Jews. You can be anti-Semitic and hate Israel, but not support terrorism and just want to try to get on with your life, which is probably most of Palestinians. So the question there is, what are the things? What are the list of things you would need to enforce by policy and condition of aid that do move towards that culture shift? It's something that I don't think anybody spent a lot of time thinking about it. I haven't until this question. It's a really good question. Something I should write about. Others should write about. But I agree with you. There's going to be a lot of that in street signs, the glorification, the martyrdom glorifications, propaganda, obviously what's in the media. Textbooks, remember, are Palestinian Authority textbooks, so ultimately we still have a problem in Ramallah with textbooks. But yes, I think that should be a core pillar of the what does come next within the parameters of what should not come next. That makes sense to me.
Another question is, how, like you said, there might be a new party of God that's, similar to Hamas, but just under a new name. How do we keep the Iranian influence out of the region? It thrives on instability, and any new teetering government or society on its first steps is rife for Iranian influence.
Completely. To the extent that you can fence off any financial institutions that are being used and ensure that we have clear pictures into all the banks, threatened with sanctions and all that kind of stuff if they were ever to go afoul, crack down as much as possible on illicit finance concerns, set up parameters for the government to implement, along with security control along the Mediterranean and the Egyptian border, to do as much as you can to prevent the kind of smuggling that we've seen over many years that the Egyptians have allowed to happen by the Iranians. You will be able to do some amount of that. To the extent that the Hawala system is used, or other types of money transfers are being explored, we're going to have to just do whatever we can. And the Israelis, I'm sure, will do whatever they can to look at that. Crypto has emerged as a major concern as well. We've seen a lot of crypto wallets that Hamas was operating be seized by the Israelis. There's going to need to be some crypto regulation and thinking about how to prevent crypto from coming in and playing a role as well. So I don't know that there's going to be a magic wand here, and I don't think you're going to be able to stop it all. which ultimately is why you need the security presence to respond to threats that are ultimately inevitably going to emerge. And we see that in the West Bank, right? We see that in Judea and Samaria. The Israelis have security control, and yet there's massive amounts of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Iranian terror cells, and they have control of the border with Jordan, and yet there's a massive amount of smuggling of arms we've seen come in. So there's no foolproof answer here, but at least you have a chance to start over with these parameters and try to have some sort of a government that promotes a civil society that's completely different to what has existed and what exists under the Palestinian Authority as well. If they can move in that direction, along with setting up as many guardrails as you can on the illicit finance side, on the smuggling side, on the influence operation side, on the media influence side, Al Jazeera, others not being there, that will get you some part of the way, but not all the way.
Sure. And I think this will be our last question, but going back to culture, not Palestinian culture this time, but Western culture, we have seen post October 7th an outpouring of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic sentiment in the media, in Hollywood, on college campuses. Even if we're able to successfully implement these policies, how do we prevent more Western pressure to say that these policies are occupation or oppression of the native peoples?
Yeah, they're going to say that. That's just going to happen. And I think that we need to be very firm as Americans in stating what the clear objectives are, what our principles are, and that paramount is Israel's security. Respect and human dignity for life is antithetical to Hamas rule. It's antithetical to having an environment where terrorist organizations can organize and breed and radicalize, and therefore to ensure both Israel's security and the improvement of life for the people in Gaza, there needs to be some element of Israeli security control with a Palestinian democratic civilian control. The detractors will call that occupation. They will say horrible things. They will put that into the BDS movement. ESG firms will try to do their negative ratings, as we've seen in places like Morningstar, though Morningstar has finally cleaned up their act, though it looks like there might be other actors out there. So I think that if anything we have learned over the last 3+ months is you're never going to get these detractors on side. They will always say the most horrific things, even in the wake of the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, even with the videos that they have been shown. UN women cannot even condemn sexual crimes against women because they were Jews. I don't have a lot of hope for them avoiding calling whatever Israel does occupation in Gaza. So what we need to make sure is it doesn't influence our elected officials, that we expose who they are, what they stand for, put them on defense, go on offense against them in the UN. I'll tell you, that's my big complaint against the Biden administration throughout this process. At times they've vetoed resolutions, at times they've allowed resolutions. In certain agencies like the WHO, they actually supported an anti-Israel resolution, which made no sense. They just vetoed the exact same resolution of the Security Council. And yet, when have you ever seen the US put forward our own resolution and force the Chinese and Russians to veto something? Why aren't we on offense at these organizations? Why aren't we putting them on defense? There's, why do we have to be into a corner surrounded by detractors of Israel and anti-Semites and then say, okay, stop beating us. We'll agree to this text if you just take out this language. No, we should be on offense. And that's what we're going to need to do differently over the months and years ahead, because playing defense is a losing game.
Thank you, Richard. You are with us entirely as voices of moral clarity. And we should not, be cowering into a corner when actually, we do have the moral virtue in this case. It's as though the victim has become the perpetrator. We certainly were not responsible for October 7th and are forced to fight against this, or else there'll be more and more and more October 7ths. So thank you so much. And we thank you. We thank FDD. And I want all of our viewers to, first of all, I apologize that there were so many questions that came in and we did not have a chance to get at all of these questions. Some of them were really excellent. And I'd love you all to tune in next week, same time, on Wednesday at 12 noon, 7 p.m. Israel time. We're going to have Amichai Cohen, who is a brilliant legal scholar, who will be talking about Israel's referral to the ICJ. And again, thank you. Thank FDD. And I want all of us to support the work of FDD as well as the work of AMET. You could go to fdd.org and ametonline.org to keep us running. We are on Capitol Hill every day. I've had seems like a million meetings this week. And we write and we publish. And please also support the excellent work of our wonderful colleagues at FDD, the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. And you can support us at ametonline.org. Thanks once again, Richard, for your wisdom, your knowledge, and your brilliance. Take care now.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.